ago the clock washed midnight away, bringing the dawn. Oh God, I must be dreaming. Time to get up again and time to start up again. Pulling on my socks now. Where did the night go?
Thank you very much for joining us, everybody. It's a great pleasure to connect with you digitally and have a conversation about the night and night spaces. I'd like to thank Hera initially for suggesting this webinar series, and as a team we're delighted to participate and share our work with the wider Hera family. So this panel is part of the Hera project that Katie has mentioned, and it focuses on the Rotterdam sub-project, and I will kick off on discussing some recent audiovisual production by a group of young Dutch-Cape Verdean filmmakers. I would say at a time when we are mostly, almost entirely, still prevented from going out, especially at night, the arts remind us of the importance of the night in the city as an important site for connecting, for diverse groups, making memories, and creating and consolidating a sense of belonging to places and cities. And this is something that all our papers more or less touch on. The Dutch-Cape Verdean filmmakers that I refer to here are all from Rotterdam, and which is a city that is home to the third largest Cape Verdean diaspora in the world after Lisbon and Boston. As I was researching their work, it became apparent that in almost all their films, there is a notable exploration of the aesthetics and narrative potentialities of darkness and privileging of nighttime urban settings. In this presentation, I will discuss how the nighttime cities, with its evocative and elusive play of light and darkness, and time space where there's fuzzy boundaries between things, spaces, and people that darkness creates, is key in dramatizing the unresolved tension between a sense of displacement and belonging. These films tap into the multi-sensory experience of moving through darkness, as geographer Tim Edinsaw would say. They invite us to look at the city otherwise. So these films arguably mobilize a nocturnal imagination that destabilizes conventional perceptions of the city. And darkness is key here. And I draw on Desertos when he speaks of the idea of opacity of popular culture that could be said to manifest itself as a rock, dark rock that resists all assimilation. So I'm drawing on the connection between darkness and resistance to assimilation here. Drawing on studies by Dunn and Edinsaw also. I wish to further connect the aesthetics of darkness with the politics of opacity, therefore, as developed by Glissant in his articulation of the poetics of relation. Glissant, as we know, defends the right to opacity in his reflections on the possibility of intercultural communication against the idea of comprehension, of apprehension, i.e. total control. So I would argue that in relation to Rotterdam, darkness seems to envelop the city in these films and evokes a quality of an unknowability that is part of a discourse of resistance in the construction of, in film, of Rotterdam as a post-colonial city, as Francio Guadalupe also has defined. So just quickly, a few words about Rotterdam. It's Europe's largest harbour. It's a city deeply embedded into the global history of Cape Verdean migration. Since the 1950s, it's attracted migration from this archipelago of 10 islands, 9 inhabited, off the west coast of Africa. It is significant that the city has often been described by the community, the Cape Verde community, as Cape Verde's 10th inhabited island, which also invites us to think of the urban space in terms of Glissant's thinking of relationality. The diaspora in the Netherlands has often been described by the community itself and the authorities as silent migrants, i.e. hardworking, keeping out of trouble, keeping their head down. But the correlation to this is that they are often perceived as invisible. This is compounded by what filmmaker Janilda Bartolomeo has described as a past unrecorded, invisible in official histories, and which she retrieves through artistic practice. And in this, in her works, the NITE plays a key role as she delves into the history of the city, much of which was unknown to her. So I'm going to discuss the work of three filmmakers, starting with Janilda and her project, which entitled The Creole Lens. The recurring Cape Verdean association of Rotterdam with the archipelago imaginary suggested in this 2018 short by artist and filmmaker Janilda Bartolomeo. The film is the result of her research into her own family history and community history, which was, as she herself states, almost entirely unknown to her before she embarked on filming The Creole Lens, Água de Choro, Água de Mar, which translates as Waters of Tears, Waters of the Sea, and which is subtitled as a poetic view of the Cape Verdean collective memory stored within the living and breathing archive of our lived experiences. The film opens with a black and white shot of the rippling seashore, close to the ground level camera, inviting us to take the position of someone entering the water, a ship just about visible on the horizon. The visual gambit here aims to historicize the narrative of connecting it to Cape Verdean history of migration, many of the early migrants to the Netherlands finding work in the ports and on cargo ships. The sea-aligned shots here, which with the short film opens, cut to nighttime takes of unidentified city streets that you can see here, where the subjective camera settles on different, seemingly anonymous buildings, but that are actually very important sites of early Cape Verdean settlement in the Netherlands, such as the Pensão Delta, the Delta Hotel, which you can see at the bottom on the left, and where many new arrivals stayed, and which was an important meeting point for anti-colonial activism in the 60s and 70s. Now, these street scenes include shots of deserted square, which you can see at the top, which the familiar eye will recognize as Rotterdam Cape Verdean, very much connected to the Cape Verdean history, the Pracinha de Quebrou, the square of the broke, the penniless, which is the area where many Cape Verdeans arrived and many Cape Verdeans restaurants and bars were located. That said, no information is given either through voiceover or subtitles or any specific cues. I would say the darkness emphasizes the viewer's position as an anonymous night walker for whom the city remains, to a certain degree, inscrutable and opaque, to draw on Glissant. The sounds that the clip uses, the sound allows the sounds of the waves washing onto the shore to flow uninterrupted from the images of the opening seascape onto the urban rain-drenched nightscape that follows, creating a kind of sonic palimpsest in the urban nightscape. The aesthetic of the city, covered in darkness with its smeared contours, informs the film revisitation of the city's migrant history. So in this way, the filmmaker's own cinematic vision as a Creole lens finds expression in the fuzzy unknowability of darkness, its opacity. I'm going to quickly refer to the second filmmaker, Ivan Barbosa, who is also an AP associate partner on our project and will be producing a documentary on the Cape Verdean community for our HERA project. In this film entitled Cabo 2012, revolves around the anxieties of second and third generation Cape Verdeans living in Rotterdam. And Bell Hooks reflects on the fact that we know, and I quote, we know ourselves through the art and act of remembering. In Cabo, the night scenes provide crucial moments of conviviality and intimacy through which the younger generation negotiate their Dutch sense of identity vis-a-vis their Cape Verdean heritage. These scenes are mostly domestic, in which a sense of belonging to the community is covered. And we have different cues within the home, for example, in the image at the bottom, which also refer to a very strong connection of Rotterdam with the anti-colonial struggles. So the support that in the 60s and 70s, Rotterdam gave to the anti-colonial struggle. So the home becomes this link between past and present and community and private. I'll move swiftly to the last filmmaker that I'm going to discuss, Edson da Conceição. And I'm going to start talking about his 2019 film called Last Stop. If Ivan Barbosa focuses mainly on Cape Verdean heritage, Edson da Conceição, his film framed the super diverse city of Rotterdam and diverse experiences of migration and belonging in the Netherlands. His first short, entitled Eindhoven, or Last Stop, tells a story of a Dutch-Moroccan youth who boards a tram armed with a suicide vest. Following his boarding of the tram under cover of darkness in the early moments of the short film, much of the action takes place in a dimly lit carriage. The steamed up windows and darkened outside reduce the visibility of the outside and help to concentrate our focus on the psychological drama unfolding on board. Here, the young man is approached by an elderly Moroccan immigrant who hears him mutter in Arabic. Oblivious to the potential danger, the elderly gentleman strikes a mundane conversation with the younger man about the difficulty of getting hold of a decent second-hand car and to drive back to Morocco. During the brief exchange, we learn that the young Dutch Moroccan's difficulty in finding work and the mention of the discrimination that he has suffered. This leads to a moment of mutual understanding between generations as the older man comments, "Nothing has changed," referencing his own struggle in the country. The chance encounter culminates with the older man embracing the younger one and defusing the situation. So the younger character decides not to trigger the device. Initially, the short film plays on the traditional associations of darkness and danger, such as when we see the young character dramatically fiddling with his device against the gloom of the urban night, which you can see at the bottom. Yet, just as the film is about dispelling negative presuppositions, the nighttime setting is revealed as key in enabling this to take place at all. Indeed, their mobility, the character's mobility under the cover of darkness, dramatizes their social invisibility, but also their claim to belonging within the public space that the public transport obviously also represents. If in his first short, Conceição engages with issues of social marginalization and radicalization among second-generation immigrant youth in an unidentified Dutch city, his following production, Por Foto, is set in his own home city of Rotterdam, and specifically in the area of Spangen, where Conceição grew up, which is one of the most deprived areas in the country. 85% of the population of immigrant background, Surinamese, Cape Verdean, Moroccans, Turkish. This film centers on the robbery of a money laundering business by 3 Rotterdammers, black youth. If in Eindhoven, the previous short, the extreme close-ups in chiaroscuro composition add the intensity of psychological drama, in Por Foto opens with a panoramic night view of the city of Rotterdam, which you can see at the top, also reflecting the wider range of lived experiences that the film captures. The film title derives from a slang Surinamese origin word meaning rotten city, and the film only briefly gives us a glimpse of the stunning landmarks of Rotterdam skyline when, and you can see that at the bottom left, the camera fleetingly captures the iconic Erasmus Bridge with its illuminated cables rising up against the dark waters of the New Maas River. The glimpse of Rotterdam's futuristic skyline of post-war reconstruction only happens when, after the robbery, the homeless Moreno character, who you can see in the shot, treats himself to a night in a plush high-rise hotel. In this way, the nighttime skyline, sky-high view is poignantly deployed to contest the seduction of the city as a spectacle. In fact, for the most part, the city is shot at ground level with minimal use of artificial lighting. In the case of Porfoto, the darkness repeatedly envelops the characters as they navigate the city streets of the deprived neighborhood, illustrating their social visibility and the dialectics between familiarity and process of defamiliarization of home ground. And it's interesting that Moreno, one of the places where he does find some kind of connection in the city is in the barbershop that you can see, where you can see him at the top right. So I'll move swiftly just to comment on the last short, which is Last Ride, short of 2020, which is another single night film by this director. And I'm quoting Will Straw in this. The nighttime reliance on mostly immigrant labor force is brought to the fore in this film through the main character of the migrant taxi driver, who gives his name as Sam initially. And you can see him there at the top. Having hoped to finish his late night shift, Sam is obliged by head office to collect one last customer. This turns out to be an older, frail Black woman, Joyce, you can see that at the top right, who asks the driver for a detour ride around the city with stops at different locations meaningful to her in her life in Rotterdam, before she asked to be dropped off to her final destination as dawn moves into daytime. In a kind of revisitation of the buddy movie format, the unlikely camaraderie that forms in Last Ride between the initially disgruntled and withdrawn Sam and the chatty Joyce is forged in a seemingly dead of night, the suspended time between before ordinary everyday business resumes. Stops along the way, again at locations far removed from the flashy places of the Netherlands industry and business nerve center, provide moments of remembrance of a lived experience in the city, the weekend and evening dances, the favorite late night snack bar. You can see that at the bottom left. When Joyce says she could be herself outside of the drudgery of everyday, Through these moments of reconnecting with familiar places of the past, the driver himself rediscovers his sense of identity and belonging to the city. And this is made clear as the character bids farewell as he revealing his full Arabic name, Osama, rather than the abbreviated version Sam that he had gone by before. So just briefly to conclude, in all of these films, in this really rapid tour of the city that I've tried to give you, the night emerges as a canvas on which undocumented and often untold stories connected to the history of the city are brought to the fore. Stories of transformation, recognition, and reflections on belonging. And as they change the story of the night, so from traditional criminality and danger, they also change the story of the city. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sara. Next, we have Serger Kersbergen, who is a PhD candidate at the Leiden University Center for the Arts and Society within the Leiden NITE project. His research covers themes such as identity, masculinity, gender, and landscape.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for listening. I'm gonna try and continue on in the line of Sara, in the sense that I'm also talking about the Cape Verdean community, as we're in the same project. So I wanted to start by saying the following about the Creole Lens, which connects to my presentation. So she mentions that Cape Verdean migration towards the Netherlands is strongly connected to the sea, as well as to sailing and ships. And so is the history of Cape Verde. Under Portuguese colonial rule, the island served as a transit port for slaves from West African countries that were transported westwards to the United States, Brazil, and the West Indies. And in the 19th century, escaping drought and famine, many young Cape Verdeans started working for US whaling ships. And this tradition of maritime work established a particular pattern of migration, which is visible in the places where Cape Verdeans settled over time, often in port cities such as Rotterdam. So Cape Verdean migration to the Netherlands started around the 60s when many young men were trying to find work on Dutch or international ships docked in Rotterdam. And they explored the city in several ways. They were in need of finding an employer. They had to arrange paperwork to go to sea. They had to buy clothing and equipment. But they also were eager to spend some time somewhere in the city's bars, clubs, and cafes. And the places where these men would find work or find each other afterwards has been remembered through stories, which are often translated to music. Because what is so particular about the history or about Cape Verdean migration to Rotterdam is that many of these sailors had some musical talent. They were able to sing, to play guitar, or play other instruments. And in this sense, they were able to inhabit both the artists and the workers' world. And they were able to integrate the experiences of labor and life in Rotterdam in their music. So the local migrant experience becomes a major theme in Cape Verdean music of the 70s and 80s. And it often relates struggles of daily life, of work, highlighting issues of illegality, citizenship, and mobility. It was also at the same time a way of reporting back to the homeland and other diasporas because, and this is sort of the first night labor in Rotterdam for Cape Verdeans. Rotterdam was also where the first Cape Verdean record label, Morabeza Records, was founded. And many of these artists, sailors, went to record there. So the photo on the right-hand side of my presentation is a shot of a recording with Morabeza Records. And several of these artists were in fact sailors. And later, many more studios emerged throughout the city as entrepreneurs, Cape Verdean entrepreneurs, discovered the potential, not only of the musicians, but also as a business model. However, for the musicians, it was often not sufficiently rewarding as a profession. So they looked for work during the day, or they worked during the day, and they performed and recorded at night and in the weekends. The development of the studio environment contributed to the professionalization of the music scene. And it attracted and developed professional musicians. And it also led in the city of Rotterdam to a vibrant community nightlife. So as I said, music was a means of reflection on the life experiences of Cape Verdean migrants, and it was also a very important means to construct a diasporic identity. And at the same time, speaking of the city, we also can see that music as a testimony of the daily rhythms and activities that take place in a 24/7 city. Work and other activities that take place during the day are strongly connected to what happens during the night. So navigating the nighttime city was as much part of the sailor's lifestyle as it was going to sea. And it is also a very well-documented experience in music that creates a particular image or imageries of urban life. So now in this presentation, I'll try through music, interviews, and newspaper excerpts, I'll try to provide an insight into how Cape Verdean music creates a narrative of the diasporic experience in Rotterdam, displaying how the city was imagined, experienced, and lived. So on the right-hand side, we see another boarding house, or pension, as we say in the Netherlands, another hotel in which many Cape Verdeans were received, such as Sara mentioned already, Delta Hotel, which was the first one. Because traveling to Rotterdam was often was an enormous undertaking, but with the help of a network of other Cape Verdeans, newcomers were quickly eased into territory. They found a place to eat, to stay, and to work. And many of these boarding houses were owned by Cape Verdeans, and they were involved in arranging maritime work for newcomers. So they functioned as a spill between companies and new recruits. This was also one of the first business models for Cape Verdean entrepreneurs in Rotterdam. However, those looking for work faced many challenges in the city. And this is also what is testified in many songs. So I'll show a song and I'll let you hear a song by Abba Lima, who wrote a song, Rotterdam, around 1977. And in the meantime, you can read some of the lyrics.
Rotterdam, minha vida.
I'll start it again.
Rotterdam, minha vida, que é tão fácil se me custa imaginar. Erguei pela manhã, com barriga apertada, bapa baraca, cinta num banco, na incerteza, da espera cai de céu, barco que te aceita empregamos.
All right, so Rotterdam, the song, is a testimony almost in the form of a lamentation, as you can hear by the way he sings, of the conditions of Cape Verdeans in the Netherlands. And I will comment on a couple of issues that the artist Abelima highlights in this song. So first of all, as I said, it's a testimony of the hardships. The song was written during a time of economic recession, in which many Cape Verdeans were replaced by Asian seafarers who had lower salaries. So finding a ship during the period in which today's song was recorded was not easy. And in the song, he mentions one particular place, which are the barracas, the barracks, which were the employment agency for sailors in Rotterdam, near the port area of Rotterdam in those days. And they went there every day with few expectations of securing a job, as is heard in the song. At the end of the fragment in the presentation, he mentions that if I go back to bed, I might find a one-way ticket that takes me to the border. So the Cape Verdeans came to the Netherlands often illegally, especially in these difficult times, and they had to be watchful for police to show up on their doorstep. And going back to the boarding houses or going back to bed, as he says, during daytime was risky as aliens police were often looking for illegal immigrants there. So daytime, in this sense, is represented in not only as an endless search for work, as an endless routine, it is equally problematic because it harbors the danger of being discovered as a non-citizen. He says, if I get offered a ship, I have to go without asking the price, or someone else will take my place. Because it was often through intermediaries who asked high prices that sailors would find a ship, often with very bad or unacceptable working conditions. And these issues actually come forward in newspaper articles from the 70s and 80s. And I'll show you two of these headlines. So as Abelima already narrates, the pensions were no safe haven. And the left heading on the left heading here in Dutch says, police arrest 30 Cape Verdeans. Because in 1970, the newspaper Trouw published rumors of recruitment practices by a subcontractor that convinced Cape Verdeans to hand in their passports and 100 guilders, for which he would find them work. But according to the newspaper, after the police discovered these practices, the whereabouts of these 30 Cape Verdeans were easy to find, and they would be sent back to Cape Verde. The heading on the right-hand side is even more shocking. It says Cape Verdeans confined/detained, and shipping companies using sailors as slaves. In this 1981 article of the Volkskrant, another Dutch newspaper, it reads that around 200 Cape Verdean men were being held in slave labor conditions, as they say, for inland shipping companies. They would have had to pay between 700 and 1,000 guilders in order to get a job, for a salary that didn't even reach minimum wage. And labor conditions were very bad. Working days were very long, and they were only allowed to leave ship for groceries. And I think this connects well to what Sara mentioned surrounding the term silent migrant as well, as even though these issues, like the ones discussed now, are voiced through music, they are endured in silence, often invisible from society. So, besides the living conditions or the working conditions, songs like these comment also on the experience and rhythms of the city, creating its imagery, as I said. And these visits to the barracas, the employment agencies, they connect to a route through the city. The bars that were visited in the after hours, after job searching, are part of this. So as a former sailor mentions in an interview, the daily rhythm was always the same. You wake up in the morning, or you go to the shipping company, or to the barracas, so to find work. You eat something in the afternoon, you eat something in the evening. Then if you want to go to sleep, you go to sleep, or you go out. You go to a cafe and find people to converse with. You had cafes to play billiards or play cards, and like that over and over. So this quote shows great parallels to what is sung about in the music. Going back to Rotterdam, the song, where Abelima firstly refers to the barracas, he continues his possible journey through the city, visiting either one of these two bars that he mentions on the right. He says, if you can't find me in the barracas, I will be at Papa de Dona's or at Tio Poya's bar to spend my time. He refers to the two bars with the pseudonym of the owners. Papa de Dona translates roughly to Father Fat Finger, as the owner allegedly had large hands. And Tio Poya translated to Uncle Pimp, which was because the bar additionally offered prostitution services. And both owners actually saw a gap in the market with so many sailors who were bored and looking for distraction in the city of Rotterdam. So to conclude, a comment on the connections between day and night in the experience of the city. I summarize the process of looking for work in the title of my presentation as Eat, Sleep, Work, Repeat. I'll revise the title of my presentation slightly to Eat, Sleep, Look for Work, Go Out, Repeat. And this routine becomes part of a common identity that is created between those that live similar lives and have similar experiences, an endless and repetitive process. And this monotonous life is often confirmed in interviews when asking sailors about their daily lives in Rotterdam and in music, where day and night become a single, continuous and arduous course of events, and where the night seems to be as equally repetitive as daytime. So whereas the night is often highlighted for its potential for freedom and expression, letting go of struggles and routine activities of the day, it is important to emphasize that the experience of the night are very context-specific. And the romanticization of the night that is overly present in popular music, film, and literature, where the night is often liberating in some kind of way, is contrasted by accounts of an endless and repetitive search for work, alternated only with some distraction that the night offers. I'm going to include a link in the chat for a short playlist with a couple of songs that as a selection of the Rotterdam experience in music, which is a combination of modern and older music that relates something on Rotterdam. If you have any questions about those songs later, feel free to ask. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Serger. And if anyone is listening and has questions from the first two presentations, please do put them in the chat or continue to think. And if you have anything, add that to the chat as we go on. So next we have Camilla Krakowska Rodrigues, who's assistant professor at Leiden University Center for the Arts in Society. Her PhD thesis on the motif of travel in Brazilian and Mozambican literature was awarded with the Fernão Mendes Pinto Prize and published by Instituto Camões. So thank you, Camilla.
Thank you, Katie, for the warm welcome, and welcome to everybody. I'll continue with the presentation on Cape Verdean memories and identity negotiations in Rotterdam. Let me just see whether I can share my slides. Let me see. Yeah, is it working? Okay. So As already both Sara and Serger discussed, the Cape Verdean community in Rotterdam has left a clear imprint on the local culture, especially in terms of music. However, they are not so much visible. So there's this notion of the silent community, silent migrants. However, recently, this cultural and historical legacy has been more and more recognized, on the one hand, by the local authorities through, for example, the projects like the digitalization of the Morabeza recordings by the City Hall Archive, and on the other hand, the descendants of those first migrants are also actively engaging with the memories of those first migrations. And my colleague Maxime will be next talking about one of such projects, the story at Nyashpaish, where the first generation migrants were interviewed by younger generations. In my talk, I would like, however, to focus specifically on the field of performing arts, which are a very relevant aspect of urban nightlife. And I think it's very important to address it now, especially due to all COVID-19 measures that highly impacted the possibility of performance and put on hold several undergoing cultural productions. For today, I chose two case studies, recent productions by two women of Cape Verdean descent, born in Rotterdam. Lena Evora presented music and stories from my fatherland, and Sonia Diaz presented the story of my mother. So you already see in the titles that the ideas of home, belonging, and memory of migration are the key narrative lines in these pieces. As I'll present, they operate at a very interesting liminal space between actually discovering memory and creating memory, and therefore they offer very inspiring insights into, on the one hand, the migration history of the Cape Verdean community, but also to how to address the Rotterdam's multicultural social texture in a way that is more inclusive and does not silence certain histories and certain voices. So first, a bit of theory. So since the stories address the idea of home, I'll work with the notion of home as presented in diaspora studies, but also more from a social science perspective. So in the so-called Caribbean paradigm of terrorizing diaspora challenges this easy binary home versus host. And here, and it invites us to view the collective identity of homeland and nation as vibrant and constantly changing, so that we need to ask, where is home actually? However, this does not imply that there is no home at all. Rather, there are different elements of home, the contours of a space of belonging, as Sara Ahmed argues. And this space of belonging is, on the one hand, clearly delimited, but on the other hand, expresses the very logic of an interval, as you can see in the quote here. On the other hand, more recent social science research has increasingly engaged with how the notion of home is being negotiated in the contemporary context of more efficient and affordable physical and virtual contacts with the homeland. So we can think about the diaspora tourism, which of course is nowadays highly impacted by the flight restrictions around the world during the current pandemic, but also, for example, the possibilities of online contacts. And here, what I think is particularly productive is the framework of moments of home introduced by Etemada, Duncan, and Tucker, which accounts for the different forms and also directions of mobility that allow the subject to recreate the idea of home. So you can think not only about the diaspora tourism, which is something that is mostly covered in social science research, but all different type of movement, which can be visiting friends and family in a different country, or it can be, for example, biking to a local, for example, to a Portuguese store in Rotterdam, where you have opportunity to buy some ingredients for traditional Cape Verdean cuisine. When we think about then how to capture such stories of homecoming, then and how arts and performing arts can engage with this type of memory and homing desire. In the framework of critical archival studies proves very productive for me as I develop my reading of the two plays. The archive can be seen as a concept, a practice, an institution, of course, and it performs a double-edged role. On the one hand, they preserve, but they also create memories, because memory is also intertwined with forgetting. So we privilege certain narratives where others become silenced. And critical archival studies address precisely these different tensions and fractures inherent in the record selection, preservation, and dissemination. And within this broad field, I find two concepts particularly relevant for my analysis, which is first, Stories So Far, introduced by Jamie Ann Lee in the Weird Archival Methodology. The author introduces this methodology to question how to explore this tension between, on the one hand, the static nature of the archive, because the record is being archived, is being documented, is being preserved, and supposedly offers an insight in a given moment of time into a given experience. And on the other hand, on the shifting transit nature of queer stories. However, I think that this framework can be also expanded to other forms of negotiating nomadic dynamic identities, such as diasporic identities. And Lee introduces precisely this concept of archival body that is seen as precisely this shifting site in between becoming and unbecoming, navigating between different spaces of belonging. And so a story is never a full story, it's always a story so far. When thinking about this silent position of the Cape Verdean community in Rotterdam, the concept of impossible archival imaginaries proves also very relevant. It was introduced by Gilland and Caswell to address some ethical but also epistemological issues rising from the study of records that are very important sources of personal or public affect. And as I quote, they offered important affective counterbalances and sometimes resistance to dominant legal, bureaucratic, historical, and forensic notions of evidence that so often fall short in explaining the capacity of records and archives to motivate, inspire, anger, and traumatize. And what I would like to highlight here, that the notion of imaginary doesn't imply that it's fake, that it's not true. Imaginary precisely covers the notion of stories that emerge from fragments, silences, and that are meaningful for a given community because they inspire affect. So it's not about being fake, but being recreated, reproduced because of the void existent in the official narrative. So when we look at the first play, the idea of homeland and autobiography that is implicated in affect, in stories that exist only so far and need to be retold, recreated, and performed, is clearly evident in Lena Evera's play. So the idea of homeland is really like the leitmotif behind her story. It is a symbolic quest to answer the question that this author, the storyteller, poses, which is, who am I? And then Lena Evera follows with comparing and contrasting different definitions of the term fatherland offered by Dutch dictionaries, and comes to the conclusion that, well, depending on what kind of criteria are taken into account, she would be always classified as either Dutch or Cape Verdean. And this either-or dichotomy is very problematic because it implies precisely a static notion of home and belonging that clearly does not capture the richness of the diasporic experience. And importantly also reinforces certain othering of certain communities because it provides very rigid contours or where you belong or where you do not belong. And to challenge such constraining notion of fatherland, the performer scrutinizes in a series of sketches popular stereotypes regarding the Dutch supposedly detached nature and Cape Verdean emotionality. She recreates precise different moments of home, so recurring to Edematter's, Duncan and Tucker's concept through, for example, the sketch where she receives a phone call that a friend or family member is in hospital, and the Dutch reaction would be, oh, let me see in my calendar, well, what are the opening hours, the visiting hours in the hospital? At this time we are eating dinner, let me check. The very calm, detached, planned response to minimize the disturbance of the occurrence. On the other hand, the Cape Verdean version of the reaction would be, oh, we need to bring food, we need to go for shopping, we need to cook for the poor person that is in the hospital, enumerating all type of typical traditional Cape Verdean dishes, cachupa, canja, couscous, peixe, and so on and so on. As Lena Evera announces on the stage, she engages with those different stereotypes, those cliches, to assess, and she asks explicitly, how Dutch am I actually with my Cape Verdean roots? So it's about trying to find, to assess the contours of belonging, to try to find this interval that Sara Ahmed is proposing in her discussion on diasporic identity. And the symbolic journey from such contours of Lena's space of belonging is a travel through music, So the title of the performance is Music and Stories of My Fatherland. And the play opens with the piece Fatherland, authored by a popular Dutch singer, Frank Bouyens. Sorry for my bad Dutch pronunciation. You can see a print screen from his performance of this piece on the left-hand side of the screen. This choice of this song as the opening song for a play, it seems deeply symbolic, because starting by music, by a recognized Dutch musician that that engages with his own idea of connection to the Netherlands, can be seen as Lena's claim to her Dutch identity. This is also my fatherland. This is where I grew up. This is how this is the type of connection, and this such music allows me to recreate my moments of home. And what is interesting is that this music was composed after the singer's travel through Asia, and the lyrics clearly express a longing for a fatherland that is so far away, a memory of some detached past. So while the polders are sung by him as this memory that makes one stop and reflect, the Dutch landscape is at the same time lived experience in the present for Lena. So so clearly here she explores her Dutch belonging. However, the play does not only engage with here and now of the storyteller's life, but through music, it also connects the past and the present and opens up possible narratives for the future. So while the whole play is composed by two main acts and an intermezzo, and those two main acts include several music pieces sung in Dutch, but the intermezzo is very important because it explores musically the Cape Verdean roots of the artist. And this intermezzo is simply told pre-morna, which is a Cape Verdean music genre, very important, was classified as intangible cultural heritage by the UNESCO recently in 2018. And it is not any morna, it is a morna of Lena Evara's authorship. You can see, and you can see a photo from the clip on the right-hand side. And it is very telling because, in contrast to the other acts in the play, where music serves as an important means of communication but does not really exist outside of the story, it needs to be complemented by sketches, by stories, to put this music into the context. In intermezzo, Camille de Corda works as if it was self-explanatory because of the affective nature it bears and the affective response it triggers. So this song, the title translates into the way to Corda. Corda is a village on the island of Saint-Anton where Lena's family is from. And the video, recorded in 2014, captures her meeting with her grandmother, Joana Honorata Lima. And you can see here, precisely on the photo, how Lena receives a blessing, a traditional blessing from her grandmother. This element is very interesting if we think about the issue of archive as operating in the space between recording, capturing the facts, the past, and involving affect and emotions, and opening space for exploration of the giving way to the future. Because especially given that Lena's grandmother passed away relatively shortly after the video was filmed. So within the narrative structure of the play, this song functions as an archival record that operates precisely at this liminal space between the facts and the imagination, between recreating the affect that comes with the lived experience of the past. The play concludes with a realization, I know who I am, and acknowledges precisely the role of affect in bringing people together. So Lena, as a storyteller, highlights that it's it is the love for music that brought her and other musicians on stage together. And it is precisely this human universal value, caring for each other, experiencing cultural productions, cultural expressions such as music together, that creates a community such as the community of Rotterdam with its multicultural texture. However, what I would like to, before I move on to the other play, what I would like really to highlight is that... Sorry, yeah.
We're just
I'm going over the time.
Yeah,
yes, I'll wrap up very quickly.
Okay.
And I'll just so well, this storytelling travel through personal space of belonging is not just a symbolic narrative act; it is very much embodied, and this is evidenced by the opening sentence, the very opening words when the play starts that say, "So I stand here." So this positions Lena as not only the master of the spoken word, but also highlights her physical presence. So she occupies a material space in transition between the past and the future, an archival body whose story can only be known so far. I was going to talk about the second play, which is the story of the mother of Sonia Dias, and it also elaborates very interestingly on the idea of unrootedness and rerouting and homing. What I would like just to highlight, because I need to rush, is precisely the second image. So we follow the story of Joanna, Sonia's mother, throughout from her migration from Santo Antão through Lisbon up to Rotterdam. And what is important here is that the critical scenes in her story, the turning moments in her life, like for example being denied the entry to Luxembourg, where she was traveling from Lisbon, a teenager being considered as illegal, deported back to Portugal. Those moments are precisely represented as embodied experience. So they are always accompanied by the actors, by music, and by dance scenes with very expressive movements, making us realize that the stories of migration, they are stories of affect, stories of love that need to be taken as precisely as an experience embodied story. Okay, sorry, I think I will end. I would just like to tell the last words that these stories work at the liminal space between autobiography and imaginary. And it is a very valuable insight into the dynamics of identity building of a diaspora, but all that claimed Rotterdam its home. And what I really hope will happen is that both Sonia Dias and Lena Evora had several projects that needed to be put on hold due to the current COVID-19 measures. And I hope that soon we'll be able to watch new pieces prepared by them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Camilla. Our final presenter is Maxime Schut, who is an International Studies BA student at Leiden University. She is renewing and extending the oral history project Storia de Nijpais for her internship assignment and working as a student assistant for the HERA-funded project NITE Spaces. So thank you very much, Maxime.
Hi, thank you very much. Let me see if this works. Well, first of all, I want to thank you for having me, of course. I'm very honored to be here and presenting today. Granted, also a little bit intimidated, sharing this digital podium with the people that I look up to, but mostly excited. So before I kick off, just a huge thanks to the Leiden NITE team, and in particular, Camilla, my research supervisor, who motivated me a lot during these weird times. It's weird being a student right now, and I aspire that hopefully one day I will be able to do the same for a future student. Now, without further ado, I'm presenting you my paper, Memories of Migration, Why Preserving Memories Matters to the Next Generation or Generations. And this research was inspired by and built on oral history project, História de meus pais, Creole for the story of my parents. The story was founded in 2014 by Marianne Beiering of Geschiedenis Lab or History Lab, and Davidson Rodrigues of Davidson Rodrigues Media. And together with 6 second-generation Cape Verdean volunteers, they conducted oral history interviews with first-generation Cape Verdeans about their memories of migrating to the Netherlands. Both NITE and História de meus pais are interested in preserving the history and cultural heritage of Cape Verdeans in Rotterdam, as well as increasing the visibility of this rather small community of over just 20,000 people. Therefore, the NITE team, Marianne and Davidson, the original project leaders, as I mentioned, decided to join forces in 2020 to revive the project and build on it. And instead of focusing on the first generation, this time, this study focused on the second generation Cape Verdeans in Rotterdam, and particularly to answer the question, what value is given by second generation Cape Verdean migrants in the Netherlands to preserving and sharing the memories of migration from the first generation. To do so, I interviewed project leader Davidson, as well as the 6 volunteers of the original project. Because why did they find this project so important that they were willing to voluntarily spend time and effort on it? Therefore, I conducted semi-structured interviews with open-ended guiding questions. The first part of the interviews were dedicated to getting to know the interviewee and their family's history of migration. Second, attention was given to how the stories of migration were usually shared, between whom, in what context, and what emotions were expressed and experienced. And third, the interviewees were asked to reflect on their participation in the História de meus pais project, its perceived impact, possibilities for the individual, but also on a communal and societal level. And lastly, interviewees were questions on cultural events and activities, whether these were Cape Verdean or otherwise, and how they participate as a performer, an organizer, an audience member even, and their perceived value for sharing stories. To answer the main research question, I divided it into 3 sub-questions. For whom is it valuable to preserve these stories and why? For whom is it valuable to share these stories and why? And for whom is it valuable to hear these stories and why? And I was able to discern 3 recurring themes, shared sentiments amongst basically all interviewees. So first value was derived from considering the project as a way to honor and acknowledge the first generation. Second, they experienced that knowing these stories helps them effectively negotiating and reconciling their Dutch-Cape Verdean identities. And third, sharing these stories is seen as a form of self-assertion. So the first one pretty much speaks for itself, honoring and acknowledging, particularly showing gratitude for the sacrifices the first generation made, the hardships they went through, which Serger also touched upon in his presentation. And they believe that this improves intergenerational understanding and consolidates the family and the community. But perhaps more important, it is experienced as an aid in negotiating and reconciling identity. So for example, one of my interviewees said, and the quote is there too for you to read, it is a way for me to understand myself. And with it, he was referring to collecting the puzzle pieces of his heritage through books, through stories, through music. And if I want to know myself, he said, I must go there too, pointing behind him. And there was a symbolic there. It was in the past, but also to Cape Verde. And this is something that is also written about by Roland Water in his article. Specifically, he writes that the history of African migrants that left the continent has resulted in a transcultural consciousness in process that mediates between diverse cultural elements while creating new ones. In other words, diaspora communities such as the Cape Verdean immigrants in Rotterdam are drifting within a cultural in-betweenness, he calls it. And therefore he claims they have no stable fixed home. But nevertheless, he argues that narration, so verbalizing memories into spoken word or written word, can aid in replacement of the displaced, and thus it functions as a tool in reconstructing identity. And it was very interesting to see that this, you know, this piece of academic work that it really came forward in these conversations, in these interviews as well. And all of the interviewees expressed how in the Netherlands they were that Cape Verdean, while in Cape Verde they were that Dutch guy or Dutch girl. But these stories help them to be okay with it. And as one of my interviews, Nelson said, if they want to give me a label, that's okay, as long as they see me as a person first. And that is where telling your unique story becomes important. So last, as I mentioned, it's a form of self-assertion. As Melanie, one of the interviewees said, it's important to let them hear, show them we are here too, and we are allowed to. So telling these stories, saying how Cape Verdeans came here, what did they do? This is why we warrant recognition as integral elements of Dutch society. Basically, it allows the second generation migrants to claim their space, to occupy space within Dutch society. And I like the way John Wargo has described it. He said, showing one's or telling one's story works as a narrative bridge, which visually stitch together differences. So by showing exposing our unique stories, this is actually how we come together and how we can move forward. So then what is the role of the NITE in that? Of course, or usually this is when performers are at work, amongst others, of course. For example, one of my interviewees is working on a music album called Filho de Migrantes, or Son of Migrants. So this is a good example of artists choosing to share their stories through their art, through their work, using their platform, telling their story this way. And obviously we mostly look at movies or storytelling events or music performances at night. So this supports this notion that there are possibilities for the nights. We've heard the term silent migrants a couple times now. The first time the term was coined was in 1997, or even a bit, around 1990. And a research in 1997 already showed that young Cape Verdeans were not agreeing with this term, which is still today affecting this community. But like Edna says, we are no longer silent, but I wonder, were they ever silent, or are we just not listening? So I want to end with a quote of Amilcar Lopes Cabral, an important historical figure in Cape Verde, and he said, "The fruit of the history of a people, culture, at the same time determines history through the positive or negative influence it exerts on the evolution of the interaction between man and his surroundings, and between men or groups of men within a society, as well as between different societies." So basically he says history and culture are shapers of our relationships and therefore our future. Stories are a vessel for sharing history and culture and creating these narrative bridges, as I mentioned. The night offers the space and time to share these stories, but only as long as we share the night. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maxime. If all the presenters want to put your video and audio back on, that would be great. And if anyone has questions, please put them in the chat now. Because we started 5 minutes late, we'll go 5 minutes over, so we have just under 15 minutes for questions, if anyone has them. I will begin with one. Based on all of your presentations, I was wondering if you could comment on the synergies or changing ways that night spaces and venues or environments are explored in these different historical, contemporary, and remembered contexts. So if you see any links between or changes between how night spaces are remembered between your presentations. Or if not, actually, we have several other questions. So maybe we can jump into those because we have such little time. So Alva Kenny asks, Serger, have any gender differences manifested in music participation amongst the Cape Verdean community over time?
Yes, very much so. Especially in the beginning of my creation, I think there was very little participation of women in the music scene, especially in Rotterdam, because the first generation started with sailors who were exclusively male. Later migration to the Netherlands started, which was more female since around the 70s. But music participation has been predominantly male in the Netherlands, especially when we're talking about the experiences of the city. There are a couple of artists, such as Jacqueline Fortes, who also lives in Rotterdam, who's quite famous all around the diaspora and in Cape Verde, who also includes the experiences of women, for example, in the city in her music. But this is very little, this is shared very little through music, actually.
If I can jump in for this gender aspect, because I needed to rush in the performing arts, it's nowadays it's clearly visible. So with Lena Evora, Sonia Diaz, but also a younger group Mudança, women are more and more voicing and bringing up the stories of migration that were a bit silenced, because we have very visible the stories of the so-called founding fathers of the diaspora, while precisely the stories of migration of women that Serger mentioned were not so much recognized. And Sonia Diaz play precisely presents it's like a homage to the role of women in forming the Cape Verdean community here.
Derek has a couple of questions. The first one is for Sara. He says, I'd like to hear you talk a bit more on the relationship between light and presence in the city. You made interesting observations on the use of more natural night light for the more intimate, more migrant narratives, and more artificial, the blue ultramodern light of the Rotterdam Bridge for disembodied skyline shots. So a bit more on light, quality, migrancy, and cinema production in Rotterdam.
Hi, thank you. Yes, I was really struck when I started researching these artists, how often they used the night. And Edson de Conceição actually spoke about the night as his canvas. He felt that it gave him more freedom to express the relationship of his different characters with the urban space. And he also commented on the fact that he uses minimal artificial lighting, that he allows darkness to become almost the character in the story. So the character, particularly in Por Foto, for example, which is very much about youth contesting their space in the city and their place in the city. They seem to be kind of gobbled up in the darkness, actually in familiar ground. So there's a kind of a dynamic between a familiar place that also becomes unfamiliar, hostile, and they constantly having to negotiate. And the darkness plays an important role in this. There's also the question of, as I pointed out, the only really iconic moment, well, the landscape, the most iconic feature in Rotterdam only appears very fleetingly. So he deliberately avoids turning the camera on that and pointing it to these other, often invisible neighborhoods and spaces whose stories haven't really been told. Also, in relation to darkness, I think there's this play with an aesthetic where the boundaries are become, as Edin and Nick Dunn also say, sort of fuzzy, which you can't really see where the contours of things, people end and where the other begins. And it kind of translates this sense of opacity that I was trying to connect with Glissant's thinking. And I think that's something that they try to convey, this sense that you don't have to know somebody, define somebody, but trying to define and understand somebody completely is also a way of controlling them. And there is some freedom in not being seen totally, but being seen as far as you want to be seen. So there's a play of all these ideas with the question of darkness and many others.
Derek has Another question for Serger. He asks, I heard that NITE was a routine for Cape Verdean migrants. I was wondering how this repetition of temporality and spatiality links to musical production.
Yeah, so if I understand it correctly, or the way I understand it is that you want to know also of what is what the narrative is that is talked about in music, in relation to the NITE, in relation to temporality and spatiality. Is that correct? Okay, yeah, musical production itself. So from what I know, at least, is that musical production in Rotterdam started at NITE with Morabeza Records, in which being still a sort of a side hustle, to call it like that, people worked during the day and recorded, played, and performed at night. It was only when Dutch-Cape Verde, which was the band that Morabeza Records started, got a contract in La Bonanza, which is a nightclub in Rotterdam, playing with a Latin American imagery, playing within Latin American styles and music styles, that the first professional band was formed. They were able to play as professionals in the city of Rotterdam. And this later became a lot more widespread professionalization of Cape Verde musicians in the Netherlands, with a larger night scene in which artists could perform. But then we're talking a little bit more about the 90s, maybe early or late 80s as well, in which several artists became more famous internationally and also performed a lot in Rotterdam, and in which the night was maybe less used because there was no because these people were professionals, were able to record during the day and etc. But the performances, of course, are still at night. I hope this answers your question.
We'll answer one more question from Ben Kampkin. He says, given the focus of augmentation, I wonder if you could say more about how technological innovation and extension/mediation play a role in these particular contexts, in terms of how particular technologies enable belonging or participation or circulation or hybridization, either historically or in archiving and community building now. Anything stand out on this?
Who wants to start?
Maybe Camilla would like to say something on the performances by Lena Evora, which she had some very creative solutions, particularly for lockdown, didn't she, Camilla?
Yeah, but it's really interesting because since there is this really strong conviction that the performing art are about bringing people like physically together. It's about this embodied experience. They did engage with some creative ways of how to work around the lockdown measures. For example, Lena organized some evening concerts in the courtyards, in a particular in particular like building blocks, for people to be able to attend them from the balconies, or when it was possible to have small congregations to actually playing in the living rooms of people. However, because of this focus on the embodiment, on the physicality of the experience of belonging and storytelling, there's also a feeling that, well, the technology doesn't really resolve much. Of course, for example, Sonia's performance is available on Vimeo, and there are other examples of using video clips. Use of social media is very important for the Cape Verdean community as well. However, still there is a feeling that that's not enough. So, for example, we had an interview with Lena, who was saying, I simply refuse to go on with those online concerts, online parties, because it does not really give you this physical feeling of being together. So there are two sides of the story here.
Maybe as a comment on archiving, well, we've heard Maxime's talk already about Story de Spijs, of course. Maybe adding to that, in the history of music and recording in Rotterdam, there's a large movement, for example, by Modabeza Records, but they're also trying to include other record labels in, for example, in archiving all the music of Modabeza Records in the city archives, and open on, for example, a site called Music Web, in which you can listen to all the songs and read about the history of the record label. I think there are several events that are trying to do the same as in cultural festivities online that try to revive and retell these stories online as well.
Just as an a small addition to the comments, particularly in Edson de Conceição's films, he seems to have a very keen eye for the usually invisible nighttime workers that circulate around Rotterdam, even the spaces that stay out open late, the bikers. So yeah, that's the other side of the technological city is featured in his films, attempting to capture the complexity of Rotterdam at night.
Okay, so thank you very much to all our presenters for a wonderful panel. It was very interesting and really exciting to get to see what's happening in terms of the research coming from the Leiden team. And we're now going to have a short break and come back at 1:30 UK Irish time, 2:30 Leiden Berlin time, in order to reconvene and continue this webinar series. So thank you so much for joining, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Bye, thank you.